Thank you very much for being here. My name is Brendan Devlin. I'm a master's student in political studies at the University of Manitoba. I'm a research assistant with the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, a writer, a co-organizer for this event, and I'll be moderating today's event. So I'm moderating out of Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, the stolen land of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. While this territory is covered by a treaty, it's worth remembering that this land was not legitimately ceded to Canada as an exclusive sovereign. Canada has cynically used treaties as one part of a set of strategies to impose exclusive sovereignty over Indigenous lands. Land theft, the denial of Indigenous self-determination, and the devastating consequences are ongoing in Manitoba and beyond, and it's incumbent on all progressives, anti-imperialists, and those who support social justice to support Indigenous resurgence, struggles for self-determination, and sovereignty. So the subject of today's webinar has gripped Canada. It gripped Canada through the month of February. Yet through all the news coverage, op-eds, and think pieces, a clear, coherent understanding of the Freedom Convoy has been pretty hard to come by. Many in the Liberal Party and its base of support have opportunistically used the very real visibility of hate symbols and the prominent of far-right activists to completely write off the movement as a movement of hateful deplorables. And in so doing, they evade all accountability for their role in creating the conditions that allowed the convoy to emerge. The conservative parties at the federal and provincial levels have likewise tried to use the convoy, in particular as a wedge against the Liberals. While initially supporting the convoy, with many MPs posing for photos with them, the party quickly walked back their endorsements when the movement became more disruptive than they were willing to be seen supporting. Now, despite these denunciations of the movement, which eventually came from both parties, the Liberals and Conservatives bear primary responsibility for creating the conditions that have allowed the convoy to emerge. Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to suppress and often even control the virus. Decades of neoliberal cuts to public services has left Canada's healthcare system woefully unprepared for this pandemic. Despite the lofty rhetoric about how we're all in this together, many in Canada have experienced significant hardship and some continuously suffer more than others. As government gestures towards an eventual end to the pandemic fail to materialize, confusion, frustration, and anger abound. The longer the pandemic goes on, the fewer social supports are available, and working classes are now being forced to return to work as provincial governments abdicate basic responsibilities to ensure the protection of public health. And it's significant that this shift from provincial governments comes in the wake of the pandemic, or in the wake of the convoy, sorry. While it seems likely that the convoy was not so much the cause of this shift from provincial governments towards completely abdicating responsibility, it seems that the convoy has allowed, especially conservative provincial governments, to pursue policies that they already wanted. And this can only be emboldening for this movement. While the more radical goals of dethroning the government and forming a committee with the Canada Unity, the Senate, and the Governor General, while such lofty goals were bound to fail, the basic demand that pandemic restrictions be lifted is being granted. So this movement is a reflection of the conditions created by Liberal governments, and the movement has gone beyond what Conservatives are prepared to support. The movement has seized on legitimate anger against the government responses. And their ability to do so reflects the absence of a left alternative. The movement that has seized on this anger so far has not seized on it to call for more robust public health measures, safer working conditions, but quite the opposite. They've seized on it to call for individualizing calls to end public mandates and return to business as usual. And in this sense, their demands mirror much more closely the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses than it does, say, labor unions or other progressive organizations. So the Freedom Convoy and the Trudeau government's invocation of the Emergency Act in all these senses have raised fundamental questions about Canada as a political unit. What are the social character and the goals of the Freedom Convoy? How exactly is it connected to the COVID crisis? What explains the response of various Canadian governments, and not to mention law enforcement across Canadian cities? What does all this bode for Canada's future? How will the left respond? With the decades-long recession having deepened during the COVID crisis, there's also much political confusion about whether the Convoy is working class, whether it's a protest movement, whether the Emergencies Act is wrong, or whether it was necessary to support it. There's considerable confusion about why it took Canadian authorities so long to act. There are questions around the US connection to the Convoy. So in the wake of all this confusion, we, the International Manifesto Group, present a series of panels on this critically important subject. Panel 1 is co-organized by the International Manifesto Group as well as the Society for Socialist Studies, and it will provide an overview focusing on the movement, its historical origins from critical left, Indigenous, and Quebec perspectives. So we have a great set of speakers. So I think with all of that, we're ready to move into, again, we have a great set of speakers today. We're going to be hearing from Brian Palmer, from Dr. Radhika Desai, from Dr. Niigan Sinclair, from Arnold August, as well as Anthony Omene. This is a great set of speakers to introduce this subject and this series. So without further ado, let's move forward to the speakers. So our first speaker today is going to be Brian Palmer. And I'm sure Brian Palmer, for many, needs no introduction. He is a preeminent labor historian in Canada. He's the author of James P. Cannon and the Emergence of Trotskyism in the United States from 1928 to 1938. He's also the author of Revolutionary Teamsters, the Minneapolis Trucker Strike of 1934, and the co-author of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History. He's a past editor of the journal Labor, Le Travail, and he is a professor emeritus at Trent University in Ontario. So without further ado, Brian. Sorry, everybody, for these technical difficulties. So Brian has left and is going to return. So in the meantime, we're going to move to our second speaker, who is Dr. Radhika Desai. So Dr. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies, the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, and the president of the Society for Socialist Studies. She's the author of Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. Radhika, please take it away.
The topic I've given it is the politics of capitalisms in decay. And by capitalisms, I mean financialized, socially and economically unequal neoliberalisms. And I also believe this is the only sort of capitalism that is possible. So that also poses some very serious questions for us. This implies that social democratic ways forward are no longer a viable goal. Indeed, it is possible that they are a dangerous goal, and that we really have to set ourselves on the path to some sort of socialism. The contradictions that are playing out in Canada can also be seen elsewhere. They are a combination of a broken political system, a professional political class that is out of touch with its social bases, a left that is missing in action, and a resurgent right that is taking on worrying elements of fascism. And before I continue, let me just say that, what do I mean by fascism? The word is bandied about a great deal. And to me, I'm very specific when I use the word fascism. There are many forms of repressive, oppressive, authoritarian rule, but the distinctive form, you can have dictatorships of various sorts, other forms of authoritarianism, theocracies, etc. But the distinctive element of fascism is the mobilization of parastate force in order to perform the tasks of repression, either because the existing repressive apparatus of the state is not, or is seen not to be, adequate to the tasks of repression as the ruling elites, the ruling capitalist elites see them. So here I have a number of points to make, but I'm going to stick to the time limit. So whatever I don't cover, we will cover in the question and answers. So I'm going to place the Freedom Convoy in a longer historical perspective on the evolution of the politics and political economy of countries like Canada, particularly the politics of the right. For me, the key parameter is the absence of the left. Under neoliberalism, the historic parties of the working class and of the left have moved to the right, so that they today, 4 decades into the neoliberal period, they essentially offer us a social democratic democratic or left-ish version of neoliberalism. So you can choose between conservative neoliberalism, New Democratic Party neoliberalism, liberal neoliberalism, etc. And the left has also failed to organize the discontents of neoliberalism, which are enormous, which are very, very numerous. So this has left the field of opposition to the neoliberal, opposition to the neoliberal establishment to the right. Now, zeroing in on the Freedom Convoy, it's very important to understand, number one, that it is not a protest movement, that it is not working class. It is not about freedom, but about the privilege to impose constraint on the less powerful. It is a body, a core, shall we say, capable of deploying parastate violence, which is signaling its availability for political use. Some politicians have already reacted positively to it. I'm thinking of Candice Bergen or Poya Olivier or Maxime Bernier. Now, it is bad enough that this critical piece of the fascist scenario has already materialized. What is far worse is that another equally important component of this scenario has appeared as well, and that is revealed in the inaction of governments against them, despite having all the tools they needed. What I'm referring to is the fact that for nearly 3 weeks, political authorities just watched the convoy and their occupations and their violations of public order increase in size and thrive without actually doing anything. The Freedom Convoy could have been prevented from occupying cities or blocking major transportation arteries all along. They could have been blocked well before they got to be so big. Of the two objections to the use of the Emergencies Act, that it was not necessary to deal with the movement and that the threshold had not been met, to me, the first, that is, it was not necessary, is the most important. And it is unfortunate that important bodies like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is focusing on the second. And by doing so, it is treating the Freedom Convoy as a protest. This is not good. I think it should focus on the first, because that would really indict the existing authorities. Equally concerning, I would say, are reports of police sympathy with the Freedom Convoy. And here I would also like to mention that the resignation of Peter Slowly, the Ottawa police chief, has a lot of other stories to be told about it, which we are not aware of. As a non-white person who headed the police force, I think what he had, the challenges he faced are really worth us knowing about. So why the inaction? I think that the inaction, we saw the inaction because it seems that the people in political authority at different levels of the Canadian political system did not wish to be seen to police a largely white, substantially middle-class set of groups in the way that they normally police very harshly groups that are left-wing, indigenous, non-white, etc., etc. They are afraid of losing suburban votes. It's also worrying that while polls showed that people did not agree with the Freedom Convoy's views on vaccines, over 40% were shown to be sympathizing with them, which is kind of close to the base of the Trump. You know, they say in the United States that the Trump base is a solid 40%, and that is sort of unbudging. And it is not clear how determined police action, if it had taken place, you know, rather than what we saw, which is essentially cajoling people to leave, if how determined police action to deal with the Freedom Convoy would have been seen. Eventually, of course, we know that the Freedom Convoy was removed without using the act largely, but with widespread support for using the Emergencies Act is also a concern, because we know that from experience that the imposition of such acts, insofar as they have teeth, they will be used against genuinely left-wing movements, indigenous movements, non-white movements, etc. So how should we place all this in the history of the right? And I would like to say that it is very normal to study phenomena such as Freedom Convoy under the rubric of the far right. But I don't think you can understand the Freedom Convoy or the far right without placing it in the larger context of right politics in general and what is happening to the broader political spectrum. Now, I understand right politics as essentially being the politics of property. And if you think about it historically in a capitalist context, in any sort of context really of class societies, it is electorally difficult difficult for a relatively small group of property people to organize an electoral coalition to deliver them parliamentary majorities, even in a first past the post system where small shares of the vote, relatively small shares of the vote, can be translated into majority of the seat. The class of the property is simply too small. So historically, right politics has had to supplement this core constituency with other groups, religious and ethnic groups, women. There's also very important field of study here. I remember being particularly struck many years ago by a very interesting article by a feminist scholar called Nikki Hart, who pointed out that had women, in the case of the UK, had women supported the Labour Party in as great a proportion as men did, the Labour Party would have been in government throughout the post-war period. It's only more recently, as women have increased their labor force participation starting in the 1970s, that we have seen women vote disproportionately for parties of the center left or the left of center. But nevertheless, historically, it's important to know that for a variety of reasons, which we can explore, this was also an issue. It's really a fault of the left rather than an advantage of the right, but it's something that needs to be noted. Now, in the case of the neoliberal right, which to me, the advent of neoliberalism marks a new phase in the development of the right, I would understand it broadly as follows. Number one, in this neoliberal right, there is no room for genuine conservatism, what people in Canada, for example, would understand as red Toryism, for example. So that is to say, right politics no longer includes the politics of deference. It no longer includes elements such as an organic understanding of society and its social cohesion, a sense of social obligation, etc. It is a neoliberal right based on individualism and economic interest alone. And an economic interest based on largely capitalist forms of property. Beyond that, the social components of the right can be religious ideologies, particularly of the evangelical sort in the neoliberal period, various forms of racism, various forms of misogyny, family values, etc., of a particularly petty bourgeois sort, and freedom in the sense of complete rejection of social responsibility. At the same time, the new political economy of neoliberalism has shaped the political landscape. So the political forces that arise therefrom are distinct. So, and they arise out of a social landscape of greater inequality, not only in economic terms, but also in social terms. And this includes not only greater inequality between the capitalist class and the rest, but also increasing divisions within the working class as it is segmented by skill, by wage levels, by race, by gender, etc., etc. In this scenario, it's also important to remember that in the imperialist countries, in the core countries of capitalism, however you want to see it, there has been a substantial expansion of the middle classes in rich countries. And here I mean not just small property people, but also relatively well-to-do professional types. And they constitute an expanded potential base for the politics of the right. To this, we add prosperous sections of the working class, which have historically, in the neoliberal period, walked over to parties of the right, particularly as levels of unionization and solidaristic politics have declined. And today, by the way, the social basis of right-wing politics includes both the old and the new petty bourgeoisie. By the old petty bourgeoisie, I mean the petty bourgeoisie of small property, and by the new petty bourgeoisie, I mean the professional middle classes. However, that can be a problem, and that's a problem particularly for the right, because the two do not coexist very well. The old petty bourgeoisie still tends to be socially conservative, while the professional middle class, the sort of new petty bourgeoisie, if we were to use Poulantzas's terms, is essentially socially liberal and cosmopolitan in the sense of being in favor of globalization, etc., which has also become a major bone of contention in the politics of the right. That is why we see so much warring on social values. It doesn't help that the new petty bourgeoisie social liberalism is imposed by public and corporate authorities, not because these authorities actually believe in those values or they want to practice them, but because they need to be seen to uphold them in order to retain a diverse workforce, which of course is also very hierarchically organized, but nevertheless they need to retain a diverse workforce. So needless to say, such corporate and social neoliberalism is also about the symbolic redress or cultural redress of social inequality rather than material redress. So essentially, if you hire a few women, a few non-white people, a few indigenous people, it still leaves the rest of the people of this group, the vast majority of the members of these marginalized groups, roughly where they were, or possibly even experiencing worsening situations. So this is really a divide. The right politics has to appeal to all of these sections of the people, but they point in opposite directions. And that's partly what explains O'Toole's dilemma. Should he support the freedom convoy types, which essentially would lead the Conservative Party towards a sort of old petty bourgeoisie sort of thing, while losing the support of another section, the new petty bourgeoisie, etc., which are equally important to winning parliamentary majorities. So that's why they have difficulty winning elections. And of course, by the way, this is true of all the parties, but let's for the moment focus on right-wing parties. Basically, if you look at, say, for example, the US situation, going back to, well, really right-wing presidents since Ronald Reagan have not been able to win convincingly. So you had the two George Bush victories, which were questionable. Then you got the Trump victory, etc. So it's actually very, which Trump won his election by getting a smaller share of the vote than Hillary Clinton, etc. But somehow they have to manage to win elections in this context. So also today there is a cross-party consensus on neoliberalism. So in a certain sense, all parties have this difficulty. The Liberal Party has also been finding it difficult to win elections, as we see with two minority governments. So even though there is no challenge from the left, the political order is very fragile. Okay, I'll bring other points in here, but I just want to make 2 points in conclusion. So essentially, to me, what we are looking at in terms of the freedom convoy and this importation of this sort of politics, and I use importation, I'm sure other people will talk about it, it's very concerning, because what you're looking at is essentially these right forces are offering themselves to capitalist classes, they're offering themselves to right-wing parties, and the right-wing parties are themselves offering themselves to capitalist classes who don't necessarily need them. Capitalist classes can rule just as well with neoliberal liberal parties or neoliberal social democratic parties, etc. And finally, I want to say that some of the novel elements that we are seeing here may seem quite different from fascism, but we have to remember that history never repeats itself, that the fascisms that we will see now, which I think are very serious concern, they are, of course, they are anti-communist, they are racist, and they are misogynist, but they don't necessarily have to be racist towards a particular group. Like, say, for example, they don't have to be necessarily anti-Semitic. They can target many other groups. Interestingly, they are neoliberal, whereas in the past, in classic Nazism, for example, you had the invocation of socialism in the appeal structure of fascism. So in that sense, they don't feel compelled to appeal to working people in quite the same way. So in these ways, they are different from the other, from the fascisms we have seen so far. So I will end there for now, but I will bring some other points in later in the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for that contribution. That's very helpful for us to begin by situating this movement in the broader politics of the right wing and the way the right wing functions historically in capitalist societies. So we will now move on to, we'll try to move back to Dr. Brian Palmer. So I'll introduce again, Brian Palmer is a labor historian, is the author of James P. Cannon and the Emergence of Trotskyism in the United States, 1928-1938. He is also the author of Revolutionary Teamsters, the Minneapolis truckers' strike of 1934, and co-author of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History. He's a past editor of the journal Labor Le Travail, and he is a professor emeritus at Trent University in Ontario. Brian, take it away.
When this convoy descended on Ottawa, I was, like many of you, very interested in what happened. And I sat down and I wrote a short piece that appeared on the Verso blog and that was republished on the Socialist Project. And the title of that pretty much sums up my kind of assessment of this freedom convoy. It was called Canada's Alt-Right Freedom Rage. The lumpen petty bourgeoisie does its revolting thing. Now, I wrote this in part because I was really very troubled by the extent to which many people that I'd had conversations with, or that I'd seen write about this, or that I'd heard about, particularly in England and Europe and in the United States, regarded this as a working class movement. They saw this as a mobilization of discontented workers, truckers being, you know, the kind of operative identifier of people mobilizing. So I was troubled by that, and in the piece I wrote, I really focused on the leadership, which I think many people, you know, here today will be in agreement with me, was not working class, was in fact, as Radhika has laid out, very much a right-wing leadership that was structured around many of the alt-right developments that we've all seen and been disturbed by over the last while. To me, it bore striking resemblance to what had happened in the United States on January 6th, in the riot. I don't use the word insurrection. I don't believe it was that, but the riot that happened at the Capitol. The difference, of course, was that in the United States, there was far more of a paramilitary presence, far more of an orchestrated development of events from above, that is, with Trump in the White House, in some senses orchestrating things. And in Canada, but the purpose of the convoy very much had the same, as Radhika pointed out, the same intent of sort of bringing down a government, although it was posed in particularly, I think, inept ways. Now, the question then became, what does one make of all this, aside from, you know, not agreeing with it, trying to point out that it is not a workers' movement, that it is very definitely orchestrated by the alt-right, that it is funded by the alt-right, that it is that's seething below the surface of the rhetoric of freedom were a whole series of repugnant political positions. What struck me was, and again, Radhika has touched on this, is how various layers of the state essentially allowed this truckers' freedom convoy to happen and to essentially take over Ottawa, to block the Ambassador Bridge, and to gain a kind of international recognition and foothold. Now, the interesting thing was that, you know, we all know on the left that left-wing protests have been handled very differently. And that was really what I wanted to focus on. There is law for some people, law for others. And I wasn't at all interested in making, how should I put it, in prescribing for the police how they should have shut down protests. I don't think that's what leftists should actually be about. I was interested in showing the very different ways in which left protests have been handled versus the way this was. And in that sense, I agree with what Radhika has said about the police chief in Ottawa. He's a black police chief. He was brought in to deal with a police force that has an egregious racist history. And, you know, I've heard so much subsequently about how he was blocked from doing what he wanted to do. I'm going to try to start my video, and okay, good. He was. It's difficult territory to venture into when someone is subject to racist resistance, and I am sure the police chief was subject to racist resistance from his ranks from below. That said, you know, I have to say that as a leftist, I'm not all that concerned about what the top chief police faces in his difficulties. I mean, he is there as a Black person to actually whitewash the racist police acts of the Ottawa police, and he ran into resistance. That's unfortunate, but I'm not going to shed so many tears about that. And he could have come clean and made a very good, made a useful statement about all of this, and basically resigned very quickly. He didn't, and one would not expect him to, as someone who steps into that kind of job. That's a little aside, and other people may have different views on that. The point that I really focus on is how things changed dramatically with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It was clearly not necessary. It's clearly a very dangerous precedent. For the left, I find that that there has been inadequate kind of discussion of that and inadequate resistance to it. And again, we're in a very messy situation for the reasons that Radhika stated. The absence of the left, the absence of the labor movement at the beginnings of this, all spoke to the vacuum into which the Freedom Convoy drove. It's the vacuum of the politics of our time that is potentially so destructive. And that is the vacuum that the alt-right has filled, and it is very adept, I think, at latching on to issues that many working people and that whole sectors of the society find themselves alienated from, opposed to. After all, there needs to be a critique of the state's handling of the pandemic. There needs to be a critique around questions in ways in which our freedoms have been encroached upon. There needs to be a discussion about freedom in the public health realm versus freedom of expression, freedom of association, etc. We need to have that in the absence of a left in our time, and the absence in some senses of an effective labor movement in our time have created this space which has been taken over by the right. And it will be a very difficult but an absolutely necessary job for the left to move back into that space and begin to assert themselves. Now, there was a flash of this in Ottawa when I believe community activists and rank and file union members did actually block convoy trucks from coming into Ottawa. I think it was on a Sunday night. Interestingly enough, they had to basically oppose the police who tried to get them to disperse. Not surprisingly. But the Emergencies Act is something that now has been invoked, and even though it's been de-invoked, it stands as a precedent. And particularly dangerous was, although some people may want to see the taps turned off financially for these alt-right groups, particularly dangerous is the state's invocation of the right to work with financial institutions to stop people from funding protests. We all know that these kinds of elaborations and extensions of the state's power sometimes begin with the right. There's a case of the Dies Committee historically in the United States, where they were going to spend at the end of the 1930s a period of time putting the stop to totalitarianisms. Now, these were described, of course, in bourgeois terms as the totalitarians of fascism on the one hand and communism on the other. They spent a metaphorical 10 minutes on fascism and an actual decades fighting against communism. And I fear very much that that is actually the meaning of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I think it's a very dangerous guillotine that hangs over our heads at this particular moment. I'm also troubled, and not to be at all defending the convoy leadership, but for instance, the rather draconian bail, conditions and refusals of bail to these people. I don't shed any tears again for them, but when protests and leaders of protests can be refused bail on the grounds that they may protest again, this is a very dangerous development for the left. I'm going to close there and really close on the note that the real meaning to me for the left of the convoy is the absolute need to rebuild the labor movement, to rebuild the left, processes which have to be done in tandem. I don't think you're going to rebuild the trade union movement and the labor movement without rebuilding simultaneously the left. Every time historically the trade union movement has made advances forward, it has been because it has had a vibrant left presence there. And we lack both a vibrant labor movement and a vibrant left at this point in time. That's the project. And anything that inhibits and holds that back, and I do believe the state's response to the quote freedom convoy is in fact something that will be used against the left in the future. And that's what we need to, it seems to me, to be guarding against and fighting back against. Thank you very much. I am sorry for all the technical problems.
Thank you very much for those insights, Brian. It's we're very lucky to be hearing from you about the politics of the left and the right in this context, and the relationship of both to the state and what this means for the future of the left. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Niigan Sinclair. He is an activist, a writer, an associate professor, and the acting department head of the Faculty of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. He's a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a regular commentator on CBC, CTV, and APTN regarding current Indigenous issues. Niigan, the floor is yours.
Okay, so bonjour de me magraduk, Niigan webedam de digitas namagoshin do dam di menwendam oya yayan. Bonjour mishum sak na kumasak, mijana kijik, nabiji nibakwe. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share with you the language of the territory here in Treaty 1. Yeah, it's nice to be here. It's nice to be invited by Radhika and others to come and participate in this forum. I've written lots about the so-called Freedom Convoy and the ways in which it's overlapped and repeated many of the what we'll call Canadian hallmarks of identity. And so you can pick up my columns if you'd like for a much longer version of what I'm to say today, but I've written about this numerous times, and of course I'm on Power and Politics every Friday. So this has pretty much been a staple commentary issue for months now. And what I'm concerned about, I'm going to bring about is three different things today. So the first is that this is evidence of individualism gone amok, and it's gone into a situation in which we're talking about individual rights as if we're conflating those with privileges and entitlements. This so-called Freedom Convoy was about privilege and entitlements, not really about rights. Because if the history of Canadian rights have anything to be defined by, it's most oftentimes defined by hallmarks of indigeneity. It is those things, healthcare, democracy, social welfare state, those are things that Indigenous peoples invented. Europeans had very little to do with those things. It was Europeans who, of course, added their ideas as they went. But if democracy was invented in Greece or wherever else people want to argue that it came from, why did it disappear in Europe for hundreds of years? Why was it so irrelevant until suddenly finding its root here in North America? Well, it's because of Indigenous nations. And it's because we have concepts, really basic concepts like council systems or egalitarian leadership across the board. We have concepts of the social responsibility that takes precedence over the individual so-called right. And so the evidence of that is just within the basic tenets of Canadian identity. The things that we often deem as British politeness, or the things that we often deem as the kind of sense of collective responsibility as Canadians, or even multiculturalism. These are all Indigenous hallmarks of identity, which then shaped the state that we now know as Canada. And so those residues that come through and we see gaining a foothold in Canadian law are absolutely markers of indigeneity within the Canadian identity, the Canadian national state, the Canadian law and policy and practice. And so what we see is we see many of those things as being obscured or mutated, in which people think that those things are inventions of Europe when they are not. And these things that we now think of as these liberties, which then gets changed into, or challenged, perhaps best to describe it according to this pandemic, those are the aspects that were the most helpful during the pandemic. It wasn't the arrival of the Charter of Rights and so-called liberties in the 1950s and 40s and so on. It was those markers, those residues of indigeneity that I talked about earlier, that were left to fight in this ongoing march towards right-wingism across the country, which we see in most markedly in provincial premiers, but also within the federal government. Much of this pandemic has been about pitting public health against economy. And for about 2 years, economy has been slowly chipping away at the notions of public health. But the movement towards public health came from a sense of social and collective responsibility. That is precisely the residues of indigeneity that I was talking about. They came from the idea that the whole represents the value as much as the individual, in fact, more so. And so when you see, as an example, which is the second point I want to bring up, many people in your chat, by the way, want to talk about lockdowns, and they want to talk about the impact of lockdowns. And certainly lockdowns were not pleasant for anybody. And certainly all of us in Manitoba here, we're seeing the absolute end of that lockdown in about 48 hours from now, with the end of mask mandates in public settings, as well as there's no more any requirement for anyone to isolate if you've had COVID-19. So what you'll see is you just see people with positive tests. You know, they can go to work if they want. But anyways, I've had COVID-19. You can't go to work. You're a bit of a mess anyways. But the movement towards lockdowns were always kind of pitted against individual rights. And throughout the kind of right-wing premiers that go from Quebec all the way to Alberta, there was often this separation between the ideas of lockdowns as somehow compromising individual liberty. Now, let me tell you what happened on First Nations. We know for a fact that COVID-19 impacted First Nations more than anybody else, on the tune of people in long-term care facilities. That's how fast it would spread, because the issue of poverty, which has been instilled for 150 years by the Indian Act, which people have been hammered into poverty, put into dire health conditions and social conditions as a result of the ongoing colonization of territories, results in the quick passing, or just like during the Spanish flu way back in the day 100 years ago, the disease spreads very quickly in First Nations communities. And so First Nations, using that experience that happened 100 years ago, being very cognizant and aware of that history within our stories, and also the fact that within our very creation stories themselves, we have stories of epidemics, we have stories of how you deal with epidemics, and the answer, 100%, is to turn towards one another, not against one another. That is how communities continue. So that it means to have more social responsibility, not less. This is a key thing for you to understand, because this is what we taught Canadians when they arrived on in our territories, when we, for the first 200 years, Europeans were basically a footnote to this country, and that we were the ones teaching them everything as we went along. And so for 200 years, we tutored Europeans into this sense of social responsibility based within our creation stories and our cultures. And then therefore you get the basis and the foundation of what would later be known as Canada. Now, what did you see during the pandemic? You saw more First Nations taking what we would call more lockdowns or more violations of individual rights, or what we as First Nations say, responsibility, in that people were instituting harsher lockdowns, curfews, way before Quebec issued curfews. They were issuing, following people's mandates, meaning that you go to a First Nation, you'd be followed in, you'd be supervised. You were to do something like drop something off at somebody's house, and then you'd be supervised to leave. What they did at the borders, the border checkpoints in First Nations, is they would check your odometer to say, oh, where were you going? You're going to Winnipeg, and then you're coming back. We're going to calculate that on our phone, and we're going to give you a leeway of, let's say, 20 kilometers. If you are above that, you're going to be fined. And that's what First Nations were willing to do. And so all of you who are talking about individual rights on this call and elsewhere, I'm going to bet that you probably wouldn't last more than a few minutes under that. You would have said something like, oh, well, my individual freedom trumps, and I use that word intentionally, the collective responsibility of my community. But notice that First Nations were willing for the collective good of all, because we know that the disease would spread most rapidly, and we care about people like our elders. We put them at the primacy in the center of our community and our children. We were willing to take it upon ourselves to take the social responsibility of our own individual freedoms for the good and the betterment of the community. First Nations did that absolutely collectively on their own. There was no provincial mandates for that. There was no federal mandates for that. That was First Nations doing that on our own volition. Now, throughout this entire Freedom Convoy, so-called Freedom Convoy, there has been a conflation of this with indigeneity. An absolute, much like, it reminds me a lot of the Freedom Convoyers flying the Canadian flag, when it is the very courts of Canada who don't give a legal basis for them to be there in the first place in Ottawa or anywhere else for that matter. This convoy had zero basis in law, zero. There was not one court, there was not one judge, unlike the United States where there was a couple, but there was not one court that threw out mandates, that threw out vaccine mandates or mask mandates. There was not one court in this country. Every single time somebody challenged a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate, I know this because we were on TV talking about it, every single time the court struck that down. So it is ironic and rather hilarious to fly a Canadian flag of the very state that is telling you that you are illegal. So like, you know, I was actually more adept to thinking about those who were flying flags that were either pre-Canada or some other, you know, the Confederate flag or even other flags that were being flown, because they were more likely indicative to what the Freedom Convoy was all about, not the Canadian flag. Because the Canadian flag was literally the courts, the institutions, not the political ones, but the so-called apolitical ones, the courts of the land, were the ones telling you that you were illegal. I mean, this isn't even a political issue. And so this conflation, however, with the Freedom Convoy, with the hallmarks of indigeneity, there's a number of things that were very concerning. The first is that the major leaders of this so-called convoy claim to be Indigenous. Many of them claim to be Métis, and subsequently, most of the Métis organizations that they claim to be affiliated with have either disavowed them or said that they're not part of those communities. So it's exactly the kind of theft of Indigenous identity that we see over and over and over again. Second, this was a colonizing force seeking to enter into public spaces, occupy them, and take up as much space as possible, and then enforce your views on everybody else, forcing those who are in those territories to be at the periphery. That is almost exactly the hallmark. If there's anything more Canadian about that, then I'd love to hear it. But there is nothing that that's based in more Canadian individual processes of identity than that. And the third is that there is a small element, a very small but worth noting, element of racialization that were within this convoy. Some of them were Indigenous people. Some Indigenous peoples tried to combine this movement with a number of issues that involved certain, like murder missing Indigenous women and girls. There was a pronounced Orange Shirt Day by one of the Freedom Convoy leaders, which quickly, while there are individuals who may have given assent to the Freedom Convoy to use these markers of Indigenous activism and history, immediately, seconds following that, people like Phyllis Webstad, who is the founder of Orange Shirt Day, disavowed that action. All the First Nations who are in the territory of where there was a so-called First Nations camp set up in the Freedom Convoy village disavowed and asked them not to do ceremonies, quite politely, in fact. And then on top of that, every single time that they claimed to be affiliated with anything Indigenous, that group immediately disavowed them to the tune of Cindy Blackstock most recently, saying that they have no teachings. That's an actual quote, by the way. The people who are, the Indigenous peoples who are involved with that convoy. And that's one of our most revered and respected elders in all of our communities across this country. Now, I say that because this, my ultimate point is that this movement was ultimately about a product of Canada's history. It was a product in which not only were lands being stolen, identities being stolen, and then there was a great forgettance of how did we get here in the first place, but there was also a great repetition of Canada's colonizing and imperializing forces, which I think should force us all to ponder. Not to say that those are those people, but to say they are our people. And that is a ultimate and logical creation of the state in its continual treatment and mistreatment of Indigenous peoples across this country. And what we saw during the Freedom Convoy, we can talk about the far left and the far right, but for me, this is an ultimate issue of Canada having much of the issues that it itself has produced and you know, for all of us, including those who are on this call, have been a part of the system, myself included, of producing this ongoing ignorance, mistreatment, and violence and genocide against Indigenous nations. And we saw it on ground zero in Ottawa. And we also continue to see it within the major institutions of this country. As many people have said before, if this was Indigenous peoples that were going to go colonize Ottawa, they wouldn't have made it 3 blocks. There would have been the army, there would have been no questions around bullets. You know, all this talk about the threshold of the Emergencies Act is a joke, because like if that had been Indigenous peoples, in fact, if that had been the Wet'suwet'en, like we saw with the Wet'suwet'en, there would have went in guns a-blazing in 20 minutes. It would have been absolutely no question whatsoever. And it wouldn't have been nice trucks they would have been taken away and very gently and charged with parking tickets. It would have been, you know, people put into jail for years and years and years, as you can see within, for instance, the individuals who are at the Wet'suwet'en, who are literally standing on their own lands and have a legal basis to do so, neither which the Freedom Convoy had. They weren't standing on their own lands, and they weren't standing with any legal basis to do so. Okay, so that's about all I want to contribute to for now, and I applaud and say thanks to you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm happy to stick around as long as I can, because I know that I'm not sure. I thought this was supposed to end at 1, but it's supposed to go till 2. Okay, all right. I'll try to stay as long as I can. I thought it was supposed to end at 1, but I have to take my daughter somewhere briefly, so I'll send a message if I have to go. All right, thank you. Thank you much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those contributions, Niigan. Those are such important insights about the prominence of individualism and the way that the Canadian state and Canada as a political unit really lays the foundations for the movement that we're seeing, despite the ruling parties wanting to firmly disavow themselves of this movement. We'll move on to our next speaker, who is Arnold August. Arnold is a Montreal-based journalist and the author of 3 books on Cuba, The Groundbreaking Democracy in Cuba and the 1997-98 elections, also Cuba and its neighbors, Democracy in Motion, and most recently, Cuba-US Relations, Obama and Beyond. He is also a journalist. He has published in English, Spanish, and French in North and South America, Europe, the Middle East, and India. He was also an activist in Montreal in 1970, where he was targeted by the War Measures Act. So with all that said, Arnold, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Just like to mention that 2 of the books that you mentioned have been published by Fernwood Publishing. So this is a shout out to my publisher, Errol Sharp, who is with us today. I'm going to concentrate, I'd like to concentrate on two movements, different movements. One, the Ottawa Convoy, and secondly, a long time ago, what we can call the FLQ, or Nationalist Movement, between 1963 and 1970. What do they have in common? I would say that everyone can agree, have different points of view on both of these, Ottawa and Quebec 1970, but I think everyone would agree that they are both non-conventional types of movements, looking at it from the point of view of the left or the trade union movement. So before going on to Quebec, I would like to provide, when I saw those images in Ottawa, the Canadian flag, etc., descending on Ottawa, I had pretty much the same feeling as Niigan. What is it? Is this coming a colonialist offensive against the First Nations, against Quebec? Now, what I did, I noticed two things in Ottawa, the Ottawa protest movement. One was they were singing the national anthem, right? What are the words of national anthem? Our home and native land, strong and free. The true north, strong and free. So I didn't want to be accused of being anti-working class or anti-trade unions. So I asked a colleague of mine, a friend, Don Foreman, who is in the Secretariat of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. So I asked him, look, in your union demonstrations, whether it's Cup W or others, picket lines, demonstration, do you ever sing the national anthem? He said, no. He's a man of very few words. No. The other thing I noticed about Ottawa was the Canadian flag all over the place. This was dealt with by the previous speaker. So once again, this raised my eyebrow. What is why so many Canadian flags? And so I asked my colleague once again, Don Foreman, in any of your trade union activities, protests, do you ever have the Canadian flag? He said, never. We only have the trade union flags. So for me, it might be a visual effect, but I think it buttresses the view that many of us here are saying, that it was not a working class, it was not a working class movement, even though myself and we cannot whitewash everyone there as not being part of the working class, because some of the demands, of course, were legitimate. So now let's move towards Quebec, but in order to go into Quebec, one has to give some background information because Quebec, 1960s, it was suppressed by the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act was established in 1914 against so-called the possibility of insurgency, but there were 89 left-wing newspapers that were suppressed. In 1917, the use of the War Measures Act increased substantially. Guess why? 1917 was the year of the Bolshevik Revolution. So the state used that measure in order to further suppress left-wing organization, left publications. And then with World War II, they also increased it by completely outlawing the Communist Party of Canada and progressive newspapers. Of course, they mixed it in. They also outlawed fascist organizations in World War II, but the overall lasting effect is their opposition to the left alternative within Canada. Now, we go to move to Quebec, where I'm in now. The FLQ was established in 1963. Front de Libération du Québec, 1963. Now, where did they get their inspiration from? Was it, right-wing movement or whatever? No, they got their inspiration from the struggle in Algeria against French occupation and for a new Algeria. They got this is what they are saying, it's public. They got their inspiration from Cuba, the Cuban Revolution. And all of their pamphlets, writings in those times, since it was established, 1963, leading up to 1970, there's a very clear indication against capitalism and against colonialism, and seeing Quebec as part of the worldwide struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Now, some of the people in this organization, for example, I give you one example, Marc Carbonneau, who was one of the leaders of the FLQ when it started its terrorist activity. He was the leader of the Taxi Association in Quebec, who carried out a very valiant struggle against a Canadian transport monopoly, which wanted to undermine the well-being and the working conditions and income of the taxi drivers. And there was I can give you one other example of the people who were a leading force in the 1960s, the FLQ, and that is Jacques Langteau, okay? So I just have to fast forward rapidly. What happened was that in Quebec, 63, 70, there was a lot of terrorist activities, bombings taking place. Allow me to make this very clear. I was active then. I did not support terrorist activities. And in hindsight, I still do not support these type of terrorist activities. But what happened? The FLQ kidnapped Richard Cross, was the British consul in Montreal, as a symbol of their opposition to British colonialism over Quebec. And they kidnapped Pierre Laporte, who was at that time the Minister of Labor in the Quebec government, I guess as that their way of saying, supporting the workers against the anti-working class activities of the Quebec government. Now, things came to a head. They issued a manifesto. Their main goal at that time was to liberate what they call the political prisoners. There were 20 political prisoners in Quebec penitentiaries at that time, to liberate them. And that is why they made did carry out these 2 kidnappings and made the demand for the liberation of their political prisoners. They did not get it. However, the Canadian government eventually worked out a deal with them that if Robert Laporte was assassinated, James Cross was still in their hands. If they would liberate James Cross, they would give them a free trip to Cuba without any charges against them, and they did go to Cuba. Now, just as a footnote to that, to show the positive nature of that movement, even though I do not support terrorism, but one of the people involved in that was sent to Cuba. He had a lot of free time in his hands. So what he did, he got a job in Cuba, translating for the main Cuban newspaper, speeches by Fidel Castro and other from Spanish into French. And there are other examples of this as well. So what happened in 1970? The War Measures Act was enacted by the Trudeau government. There was immediately over 500 people who were arrested overnight. I myself, I knew that I was amongst the activists on that list. And so myself and others, we changed addresses. So I got away with it. But when I returned to my house a few months later, when the dust settled, I saw that they had broken into my apartment and padlocked it. Now, what happened in 1970, while all this was going on, and just before Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act by occupying Quebec with the Canadian Army, there was an outpouring of sympathy amongst the people throughout Quebec when the manifesto of the FLQ was read over the airwaves. They sort of forced it upon the airwaves and newspapers to publicize. So I participated in some of them, even though I did not support the terrorist act. One has to say that the activities there had a large amount of support amongst the population because of why? Opposition to colonialism and opposition to capitalism, and in support of the rights of the workers. Now, this was an important movement, and a lot of us were arrested, and it was an important feature of what was happening in Quebec at the time. And now, since then, the War Measure Act was established. Now, one can ask, some of you have already dealt with it, and that is, was the War Measure Act necessary in 1970? Was the Justin Trudeau's invoking the Emergency Act against the truckers last month? I don't think either of them were justified. Just allow me to connect the dots there. So you have 2 movements. Now, the reason I raised the Quebec non-conventional movement to compare it to the Ottawa movement, it's day and night. Aside from the terrorist activities, which no one can agree with, one was definitely on the left, anti-colonial, pro-worker, while the other one had nothing to do with it. I just mentioned how some of the FLQ people involved in that have since come around, like Jacques Langteau, one of the leaders then, when he came back to Canada, he started to write for Journal de Montréal, which is one of the most important newspapers in Quebec. He has a regular column there in which he, writing from Cuba, in which he clears away all the disinformation with regards to Quebec through that media. Now, there are many other examples of those who have come out of that and doing positive things in life. But I would like to see one of the leaders of the Ottawa occupation. What will they be doing later on in life? I doubt if they will be doing anything positive, anything pro-working class, whatever. So the question is now, in Ottawa, it definitely was not necessary. Why did Trudeau wait so long? Well, I've been watching Justin Trudeau for quite some time now. He used the same tactics as he used during the close Canada down just before the pandemic hit us. Now he waited, the blockades were all over Canada. Why didn't he act right away? He waited and waited, trying to find the appropriate moment when people would get fed up and carry out racist remarks against the First Nations, which started to happen. In fact, his bet took place. We started to have a movement, we saw it through the media, against the First Nations. But of course, he was saved by the pandemic, and the roadblocks had to go down, not as a result of Trudeau, but as a result of the pandemic. Now, in the same way in Ottawa, in my view, why did he wait so long? He waited so long for the very same reason. He knew that people were getting fed up, especially in the Ottawa region. He was waiting for the appropriate time that public opinion would increase, which would give him the moral background, if you like, to invoke the Measures Act, which of course he did. But in any case, it was not necessary. But like the War Measures Act, the 1914, 1917, World War II, these special acts, even though they have two different names, the War Measure Act is less stringent than the Emergency Act. The War Measures Act, the government did not need the okay from the Parliament. They could do it on their own, while the more recent updated Emergency Act, they have to get approval from the Parliament. But in any case, they didn't even use that act. But we know for a fact that as a result of that, the examples were given, what is happening to the First Nations and British Columbia, the effect of that act is not going to be against the trade unions. It's not against these fascists, but rather against progressive trade unions. And
30 seconds, Arnold.
How much?
30 seconds.
Okay. So just, just to close this off, that we have to be clear that we cannot have any faith in the Trudeaus and the Canadian government, that these acts at the end of the line, they are used to suppress the left alternative and also the trade union movement and First Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Arnold. That historical background on how this is being received and understood in Quebec in particular is extremely valuable in this conversation. Now we're going to move on to our final speaker before our Q&A. Our final speaker is Q. Anthony Omene. Q is an award-nominated writer whose columns appear in Maclean's and the Globe and Mail. He's the host of the Unredacted podcast with Glenn Greenwald. In addition, he is a board member of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. Q, take it away.
All right, first of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I'm not going to take too long with the preamble. Just want to focus on one particular aspect of this because many of the others have been covered. And that is what I think is a rather abysmal response from the left, both in regards to what the Convoy protest was about in the first place, and the laws and regulations leading up to it. So last year in the Globe and Mail, I wrote a column with a good friend of mine, a medical doctor from around the DMV area, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, that runs a medical clinic and also does plenty of community work in his spare time. And when we were having conversations about the possibility of vaccine passports and vaccine mandates, due to what he was seeing in his clinic, he thought that passports would be the worst thing possible. Not because passports, or at least the idea behind them, didn't have some validity, but because in practice, implementing vaccine passports would make the lives of marginalized people even more difficult. And that's exactly what happened. As soon as the vaccine passports were implemented, it increased hesitancy among his patients. It made life more difficult for them in terms of being able to go about their daily lives, getting to the jobs and so on. And then once the mandates were implemented, people who were working in public sector jobs, although not very high paying public sector jobs, and even people who were working in private industry that had the echo effect of the vaccine mandates in that they were requiring their employees to be vaccinated, rather than taking an approach that added the ability for people to, for example, pay for daycare for children who are staying home from school, rather than the ability to increase disability payments, etc. The approach that the United States government and subsequently the Canadian government took was to pressure everyone to get the vaccine, but then implement no other measures to make their lives around getting the vaccine, as well as dealing with the fallout from COVID a little bit easier. Now, the issue with that is that we now have in Canada roughly an 85% uptake on the vaccine. So roughly 85% of the eligible Canadian population has been vaccinated. There is no situation, there's no public health situation or any public policy situation at all, ever, where you're going to get 100% of the population to do anything. So then the question is, how do you account for the other 15% that should have been baked into your assumptions in the first place? Well, in Canada, what we've done is offer nothing in the way of increased disability payments. So people with disabilities that were not eligible for CERB in the first place have gotten a grand total since COVID began of $600. People in remote communities, people in Indigenous communities, people in rural communities, and so on, have multiple difficulties getting access to the vaccine. I happen to live in a suburb just outside of Toronto, Ontario. I had to wait several weeks for my booster shot. It's incredibly easy for me to get the booster shot. There are people that I've had to send to various websites that are not run by any government entity, that are not run by the government of Ontario or the government of Canada, in order to find where is the closest location to even get the vaccine. The rollout has been, although people have on their own volition been able to get access to the vaccine, our governments have not made this process any easier, especially where it comes to the lockdowns, the semi-lockdowns, the mandates, etc. It has led to increased resentment and frustration among a particular class of people, generally the working class, who have increased, at least to me and to the polls, increased hesitancy due to the inconsistency of these mandates, these lockdowns, etc. Here comes the Freedom Convoy that are addressing the concerns of people that are wondering why their government is not marshaling them through this period as they promised they were going to do back in 2020, when we were told we're all in this together. When frontline healthcare workers were valued as like the people that are the bravest, the people that are walking us through this healthcare fiasco, the people that are getting us through all this are the healthcare workers, the grocery store clerks, the retail clerks, etc., the people working at pharmacies, all the people that have to get up and go to work in order to make sure that our society still functions, the people that are working at the farms, the people that are working in the warehouses, all of these people that actually have to go to their jobs rather than sitting at home and working from their laptops, were subsequently abandoned over the course of COVID. So once CERB ran out and once the lockdowns ended, all of a sudden, the very same people that we were championing were quietly thrown back into the discard pile of the working class. Suddenly, the wages for Loblaws workers, the question of as to whether they get their measly $2 an hour hazard pay, that quietly begins to disappear. The question as to whether we're going to provide for teachers and make sure that they're made as safe as possible, well, now we're forcing them to go into schools among children that are simple walking disease vectors. Well, when they have issues with whether they're going to have in-school classes or not, whether they're going to have increased capacity for, say, ventilation, whether they're going to be made to wear masks themselves, children are going to be made to wear masks whether the increased capacity for, rather the increased ability for students to sit in a class for several hours out of the day, whether the schools are going to have, say, their ventilation improved. None of that actually happens. None of the schools are retrofitted. None of them are upgraded, even though they've been sitting closed and quiet for months at a time. The vaccine, the trucker convoy seizes on all of these issues, and through their primary message is one of vaccine hesitancy, not necessarily anti-vax, but vaccine hesitancy. The second is anti-mandate. The third is anti-passport. As my friend and I wrote in our column, vaccine passports are a tremendous measure that is practically unprecedented in Canadian history, that our ability to move about freely is restricted based on healthcare status. Where it comes to vaccine mandates, the fact that unions are at the same time lionized and then demonized for members that have lost their jobs because they have not been vaccinated. So the Amalgamated Transit Union, for example, saw that bus transit workers were fired from their jobs for not having been vaccinated, and then are demonized because they went to bat to try and get these employees their jobs back. Those very same employees, when they lose their jobs, are made ineligible for employment insurance. So the choice that the government has presented to workers is that you either vaccinate yourself or you starve. It's one or the other. Pick one. That has been the solution to get the remaining 15% to get on the ball. What happens where it comes to, say, the ostensible left in Canada, and I'm including progressives, the NDP, left liberals, etc. The answer is, well, you should just go ahead and get the vaccine and everything's going to be better. This is your fault. If it wasn't for you remaining 15% of people, this would all be over already. Not directing any of your ire towards the government that refused to change its approach to public healthcare policy, social welfare, etc., to make sure that we can all get through this together, as they promised us at the very beginning of this fiasco. No, downloading all of that responsibility to get us through a public health crisis onto the individual worker. The Freedom Convoy seizes on those things. The left liberals and the progressive left, unfortunately, do not. They've gone along with the approach that pretty much whatever comes out of the mouthpieces of government is exactly what we're going to be repeating to each other, thus leading to infighting. And there's absolutely no way that any individual is able to plug the holes of a massive public policy gap. So what happens when we what happens with regards to the Freedom Convoy? Well, while this convoy is happening and while these very valid issues are being addressed, what are progressive people on the left talking about? They're talking about Joe Rogan. They're talking about the fact that Joe Rogan promotes ivermectin, that he promotes vaccine hesitancy, that he promotes vaccine misinformation, that he brings anti-vaxxers on the platform, that he's been irresponsible, so on and so on. Now, the problem is there's always a final boss of authoritarianism. There's always a final boss of the right wing. There's always a final boss of the conservative politics that prevent us from having an equal and just and equitable society. So we're always moving from target to target to target, being distracted by these cultural war issues, while at the very same time, the very people who we claim to oppose, the very people that have the easiest time co-opting both the aesthetics and co-opting the ideology of the working class, or at least in from aesthetic perspectives, co-opting the ideology of the working class, we're doing nothing to oppose that whatsoever, and we're being distracted by these minute cultural issues that are going to change on a dime. There's always going to be another person that we have to oppose. You know, before Joe Rogan, it was Alex Jones. Before Alex Jones, it was Glenn Beck. Before Glenn Beck, it was Rush Limbaugh. Before Rush Limbaugh, it was Ann Coulter. It's always a different target. So from my point of view, the issue with regards to the Freedom Convoy, and on top of that, the invoking of the Emergency Measures Act, has been a failure on the part of the progressive left to seize on the issues that are actually important, to actually talk about the material circumstances of the working class, and to be sucked into the whirlpool of continuously shifting and changing cultural issues, while at the same time ignoring and vilifying the very same people that express their reservations about the conditions that we're put in, and saying that that is not important. What is most important is that we delve into these cultural issues, because once the cultural issues are solved, everything else will be solved. Meanwhile, the federal government passes a law that, passes a measure that allows the RCMP and banks to coordinate that if somebody is making a contribution to an organization that by the RCMP's lights is designated as a group that promotes insurrection or terror or social disorder, that person's bank accounts can be frozen. That at the very same time, we've been told that these are temporary measures for only 7 days. There are permanent measures that are enacted. For example, any sort of fundraiser such as GoFundMe or any sort of crowdfunder must register with FinTrack. That Bitcoin wallet companies, or rather cryptocurrency wallet companies, must also register with FinTrack, thus defeating the entire point of cryptocurrency wallet companies. Because if you want to be able to move money without the ability of federal oversight, or that your transactions are going to be spied upon, well, that's completely been blown out of the water. That's now a permanent measure. People seem to be okay with it. So just to wrap everything up, my issue here and my point in discussing on this panel is to talk about the fact that where it comes to dealing with the things that are actually material to the circumstances of our day-to-day lives, I have a really big problem with the fact that we've been dragged into managing cultural issues and managing how people feel about cultural issues and getting away from actual material issues that will not only affect you throughout this COVID pandemic, but once this issue has either been solved or forgotten about, we're going to be dealing with for the rest of our lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Q. I think those are a lot of important reflections for the left going forward in responding to both the pandemic and the momentum of the Freedom Convoy. So those are all of our speakers. So we will now move into a Q&A section, and I'm going to give a little bit of a description of how that will go in just a moment. But first, we're going to turn things over to the co-organizers of this event, the International Manifesto Group and the Society for Socialist Studies. So I'm going to pass it first to Alan Freeman to discuss the International Manifesto Group.
I'm just wondering if Megan should go first, Brendan.
That works as well. I will pass it to
I think that's best. Yeah.
So Megan from the Society for Socialist Studies.
Okay, thanks. I'm Megan Aiken. I'm currently the membership secretary for the Society for Socialist Studies. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta in political science, and I focus on critical health policy. So a lot of this stuff was much more up my alley than some other stuff would be sometimes. Anyway, in chat, I've put our website to the Society for Socialist Studies. I would very much encourage you, if you liked, this panel. We're currently planning our next year's worth of programming that we partner with individuals. We're happy to help facilitate member events. If you have an idea for a panel you'd like to organize as a member, I'm more than happy to work with you and bring in excellent programming from all corners of the left. So check that out, please. We have membership, different levels of memberships, and always welcoming donations as well. I also wanted to plug our affiliates and local chapters program. So we're about 2 years into accepting affiliate organizations, sorry. So I think I saw someone from FIRE this time here who's an affiliate member. We also have Peace Alliance Winnipeg, Venezuela Peace Committee, Canadian Dimension. So if you are part of a leftist organization or socialist organization, please reach out to me and I can help start building this broader network. And as well, if you have a group of members of the society who are in the same, interested in similar things or in the same geographic location, please email me. My contact information's on the society website, and I can work with you to build a local chapter and broaden the network within your area. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Megan. And I will pass it over to Alan now.
Thank you very much. I think that the simplest way to explain what led the people who organized this meeting to where they are now is the words of Baruch Spinoza. And Spinoza said once, when I look at the world today, I seek neither to laugh nor to cry, but to understand. So we're not here to lay down a party line. I think if you look at the range of discussion and interventions that you've heard, that should be very clear. We are here so that people can discuss. And I think that is one of the key weaknesses of the progressive left, which is the key to solving all the other issues that people have raised about the left. Until we understand the colonial origins of our history, till we understand what settlers have done to indigenous people, what imperialism has done to the world, and how we live off the proceeds of that exploitation, we're not going to solve any of the problems that people are talking about. In other words, we're here so that we can understand our own condition. And we do that in dialogue. There's no other way. We do it by listening, something that the left is not good at doing. So if you want to help that, we have 3 sites. The International Manifesto Group site, I'll put these in the chat in a minute, is where we published a contribution to the discussion. We urge you to read that because it does deal with many of the questions that have been raised, not all of them, and respond. Read it, sign it, and then respond to it, and we will publish what you have to say. Whether we agree with it or not, we will publish it, provided it's respectful of others in the debate. The second thing you could look at is our news and analysis site, newcoldwar.org, which publishes all the news from the left that you'll find in the world that you don't see in the mainstream media. And the third is the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, which is for more scholarly discussion. If you'd like to take part in that, there's 3 things that I think you could do. One is sign the manifesto. That way we'll put you on a list where we will engage you, and you will have the capacity to organize webinars or propose webinars yourself, to contribute to the discussion, to engage and reach out to others. The second thing is do look at our YouTube channel. It's getting very popular now, and I think you'll find a lot there to interest you, and maybe subscribe to it. And the third is we need support. We don't take corporate money. We don't take state money. We don't take large donations that hold you in hock. We don't take advertising money. So you can do something very simple. Go to our donate button and just say, you're going to give us, I don't know, $5, $10 a month. If 200 people do that, that covers our costs entirely. And the reason that covers our costs is that we rely also on volunteers, and there's a volunteer form there that you can fill in and sign, and we'll be sure to reach out to involve you in what we're doing. Now, there's one more thing I want to do, which is to mention a group that is going to be taking part in future activities. This is the Naujawan group, and they have this following message. I think I've already put the web in the chat. This is young people uniting to stop the exploitation of international students and workers. And what's particularly important, and that's been a big focus of their activities, is they focused on winning compensation for truckers for wages who have been stolen by their employers, who misclassify them as independent contractors. So I'm going to finish there. I'll put all these links in the chat as we proceed. I've been trying at the same time to collect lists of questions for Brendan, but I'll be busy for the next 2 minutes putting the links in the chat. So over to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I just want to echo that we hope everyone will please check out all of these links that Alan is posting. Please support the International Manifesto Group, and please support the Naujawan Support Network. And we hope to hear more from them soon later in this series. So our first questioner is from the media sponsor of this event, which is the Canada Files. So Aidan Jonah of the Canada Files is going to ask the first question here. And then I have Hira Singh and then Megan Aiken.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. So the first question I have is just a question for everyone, which is, what role do you think the Canadian mainstream media has played in enabling the Freedom Convoy? And a question specifically for Arnold would be, do you think the mainstream media in Quebec handled covering this convoy in a different manner?
So any speaker can begin with that. Speakers, if you want to raise your hand, I can go to you.
I thought you were going to take 3 questions.
Yes. So those were 2, so we'll go to Hira.
Thank you. You know, I must tell you something very cultural. To ask an Indian to have limited time to speak is violation of their culture. You know, we invented the idea of rebirth because we wanted no limitation on talking time. Anyway, sorry, I think I've already finished my 30 seconds. Anyway, here is my first thing is to Brian. Hello, Brian. I think the position of the Black police chief has to be understood in a wider context, in a context where whiteness is the norm, where whiteness is the vantage point to look at the world. The position of a Black person in any position, and by Black I mean all non-white people, that they are in abnormal situation because they are not the norm. And their dilemma in every walk of life, as a student, as a teacher, as a policeman, as a military man, has to be understood from that point of view. I think, you know, this is a charge against Marxists about caste studies. This is against the charge about Marxists about race and those so-called identity question. Race is not an identity question. Race is a structural historical question, but race matters. So I think judging the Black chief's position in that question without being aware of what race is and how race is the very norm of capitalism, I think we will be doing some kind of injustice to that question. That's one. Two, my concern with Sinclair's position is what he is calling indigenous issues, as if particular to indigenous now, is actually those are the general characteristics of egalitarian societies. And what we don't realize that the starting point of humanity is the egalitarian societies. But how the very idea of community, how the very idea of inclusion and exclusion has been eroded by the private property going back to antiquity through feudalism and in capitalism where private property right is absolute, without bringing in that perspective, which means that what we have to struggle here against is the rule of the private property. They
Kira,
often
can I ask
talk
you to
of,
please?
sorry, this is just my
Sure.
last sentence. We often hear them and us all talking about colonialism. Without talking of capitalism, colonialism came together, and it is the rule of the private property. If we want to fight this, we have to fight against the rule of the private property, period. Thank you.
Thank you, Hira. And we can briefly, we'll hear from Megan as well, and then speakers can take any of these questions that they've heard that they'd like to speak to. Go ahead, Megan.
Thanks, I'll be really quick. So I think my question is maybe best for Brian, but I'm happy for anybody to take a stab at it. I'm wondering, you know, we talk a lot about, like, you know, how can the left finally win? Like, how can the left reorganize? And Brian had mentioned, you know, rebuilding like a working class movement on the left. But I know that right-wing populists, like populist movements, are quite successful, relatively successful, a lot right now, especially on the right wing. And I know that we've seen, you know, some attempts at left-wing populism in the US and a bit in Canada as well. I wonder, for Brian and any of the panelists, is there the potential for like a successful populist left-wing movement in Canada? Personally, I'm skeptical that one could exist without being like deeply white supremacist, but would love your thoughts, just because we tend to think about how the left could win, but you know, we try to the same tactics sometimes and, you know, still fail.
Thanks, Megan. So any speakers? Radhika, I see that you have your hand up. Speakers, you can just raise your hand as well if you'd like to respond to this. So Radhika, go ahead.
Brendan, I'd just like to remind you that there were two questions specifically directed, one at Arnold and one at Brian. I'll go after the two of them.
Sure. Okay. Arnold, so you can answer Aidan's question, and then Brian, you can speak to Megan's.
In response to Aidan's question with regards to the coverage in Quebec, well, what happened in Quebec in comparison to Ottawa, specifically Quebec City in front of the National Assembly, in comparison to, there are two different movements. In Quebec, the leadership of the truckers movement there was a person called Rambo Gauthier, who was a high-level trade union. Many people consider him to be a thug working in cahoots with the government against the trade union. He was the main personality there. Now, the other group that was involved there was a racist, anti-Islamic group called La Meute, which means the wolf pack. And they were very active in that in order to present their view with regards to the Islamic influence in Quebec. And so the newspaper, of course, reflected what Rambo Gochi was saying and what Lamotte was saying. So it's nothing really different. They just provided a platform to these people there. I would just like to add one point while I have the floor. I think, well, I'll leave someone else to answer other questions before we go. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Arnold. Brian, you're on mute if you want to unmute and respond to the question directed to you.
Okay. Well, the first question, I knew I'd get into some kind of hot water, bringing up the race question, the chief of police. Of course, race is a structural issue, but race is something that both capitalism and imperialism are able to integrate to a certain extent. There will be people of racialized peoples that will go over to the other side. Quite frankly, as I said, the chief of police undoubtedly faced a racist backlash from his own ranks, but he was the chief of police. He was there to do a specific thing, but quite frankly, he did it. I just don't see a lot of sort of political capital coming out of the left, splitting hairs over good and bad cops. The police under capitalism have a particular role to play, whether they are black, white, red, brown, even indigenous, I would say. And so if you join forces with those police, with that police, you are going to serve a certain function. When the police actually break from that function, and it has happened historically, in the Winnipeg General Strike, the police actually, sided with the strikers, left their jobs, and were denied, any further employment with police or even with national federal forces. So I just am not going to waste a lot of time shedding tears for the difficulty the chief of police in Ottawa found himself in. It's racism is there, yes, and it's an ugly phenomenon, and it should be combated all the time, and we should be resolute about that. But I would see all kinds of reasons to look to other people who are the victims of racist oppression, rather than the black chief of police, is for getting a lot of sympathy there. On the whole question of populist movements, there is, of course, again, historically, a basis for seeing the possibility of left populist movements. They are complicated, but in late 19th, early 20th century North America, you saw an abundance of this kind of thing. We've seen in our times that populism is moving more and more to the right. It is, as Megan pointed out, infected, I think, now with a lot of white supremacist and a whole series of other ideological baggage that's very problematic. In terms of rebuilding the left, I wouldn't see necessarily a working class or left populism to be the answer. I would see the necessity of, for instance, in the absence of a left, nonetheless, where I would see the necessity of things going is to build within the unions a series of left caucuses that are in fact engaged in grappling with what it means to be left in our times, and engaging in the kind of dialogue within the unions that Alan has talked about, that's necessarily going on outside the unions as well. And when there's some kind of hookup there and some kind of potential to create possibilities of coherent, left regroupments of organizations and of individuals, then a left within and without the workers, the trade unions, can actually, in my view, create the possibility of a rebirth of the left. We are so far from that right now. It's distressing, depressing, but I don't see any other way forward. And we all have our roles to play in different milieus that we operate in. So that's, those have not been suppressed. Those are still there. milieu, and there still is possibility. But whether or not it would be populist or not, it's tough enough to build what needs building. Why settle for, an orientation, a perspective, populism, which I think has always been a bit fuzzy, a bit problematic, a bit less coherent than it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And so we'll move on to Radhika for her response to a few of these questions. Then we'll move on to the next set of questions. As there seems to be quite a bit of interest, I think that we will probably go a little bit longer than 2 for all panelists who are able to stay with us. That's fantastic, but I realize we only scheduled this until 2. But without further ado, Radhika.
Okay, thanks. So I just focus on a few things that I think are important. So on Hira's point about race, of course, Hira, I totally agree with you. And I think Brian and I also would both agree that with you that it is structural. I mean, I think I kind of take Brian's very wry point, but I would like, which is, why should we worry about this elite Black person, when in fact, what we should be worried about is the condition of the vast majority of Black people, which is not addressed by promoting 1 or 2 Black people to positions of authority, where in any case, they experience great precarity, as Peter Slowly did. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is that, however, to me, the race remains critically important because the important thing is that there has been no left opposition in the COVID context, which is also why we get the complete mess of oppositional responses to COVID that we have right now. And why isn't there a left in terms of the COVID response? It's because the left has been reneging on its duty for decades. For decades, it has failed to mobilize the discontents of neoliberalism, which should have been a marvelous opportunity for the left, but they have failed. And there are many reasons why they have failed. One of the key reasons is that it is unable to recognize that on the one hand, you can't do class politics without, sorry, let me rephrase that. On the one hand, you cannot do feminist or anti-racist or any other politics without talking about class. It's true. But on the other hand, you cannot do class politics without talking about race, gender, imperialism, etc. And I think this is where the left has failed. It has failed to put all of these things in the same picture. And that's why I have insisted that we do not we try to analyze it. At least let's begin with the understanding. As Brian says, we have a long way to go, but at least we can begin by producing the right understandings. And that's why I'm saying that we have to see this as the Freedom Convoy as a form of ultra-right politics. And I want to come back to that, but I want to say one other thing, which we might as well get out of the way right from the start. And that very briefly is that lockdown, there are there's a lot of confusion around COVID. And as Brian pointed out, and I would have pointed out if I had at the time, there has been no proper left response to COVID. What would a proper left response look like? It would not be in favor of vaccine mandates. It would not be in favor of lockdowns or anything like that. In fact, it would have questioned all these things. It would have pointed out that there are traditional ways of dealing with pandemics which have not been employed. The West has put all its eggs in the vaccine basket. That is not going to get us anywhere. The West has also essentially followed a neoliberal approach to the pandemic, which precisely because it is ineffective, because it focuses on the wrong remedies, it ensures continuous prolonged lockdown after lockdown, because the disease will keep coming back, because we are not pursuing maximum suppression or zero COVID or whatever you want to call it. That's what we need to pursue. We have not done that. That's why we are in this situation. It's not because the left should be in favor of lockdowns or vaccine mandates or any authoritarian measure. The problem is that the government's response has been punitive and miserly. It has been authoritarian, and it has sought to essentially focus on saving livelihoods, which is essentially a euphemism for saving profits and at the expense of lives. That's why the Western countries have also lost the most lives on per capita terms. So I just want to get that in there. One final point. I'm really glad Megan brought up the topic of populism, because that was one of the things I was going to talk about and I didn't get a chance to talk about. I mean, I think obviously we want to explore all sorts of ways of understanding what the Freedom Convoy has been about, but I would very much urge not to use the term populist for the following reason. The term populist, in any case, we're not sure whether that's what we need. We certainly do not need the left populism, as Brian pointed out, but more to the point, the term populism is currently being used in the present context, not just the pandemic, but even before the pandemic. It was being used by the neoliberal establishment, by which I mean in Canada, the likes of the Liberals, in the United States, the likes of the establishment Conservative Party, the Republican Party, and the establishment Democratic Party. These people are using the term populist in order to condemn, in one single word, what they call the right populism of the Trumps and so on, and at the same time what they call left populism, in which they put Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Hugo Chavez, and Nicolas Maduro. I mean, the whole, essentially any kind of left politics can then be called left populism and dismissed. So I think we should probably move away from that. I think we are in the serious business of trying to build a left, and I think that's what we should go with. And one final point. They say that the establishment discourse on populism is that, oh, you know, these people are only focusing, the populists are focusing on social division. I really object to that. Whereas on the one hand, people like Trump or Johnson are exploiting the opportunities provided by social division, having no intention of actually doing anything about them, rectifying them, whereas the progressive politics, I mean, I have many criticisms of Sanders and even of Corbyn, but the point is that they do represent a progressive politics which is pointing to the divisions in order to heal them, not just to exploit them. And that's the key point that we have to understand, that this move of calling everything that is opposed to the neoliberal establishment populist must be rejected.
Thank you, Radhika. Arnold, I see that you have your hand up. Is this in response to anything we've heard so far?
Yes, just to elaborate further, what with regards to like what happened, why did this crisis break out? So with regard to the vaccine mandate for truckers. So the whole issue is, what is the appropriate attitude or policy that in this case the Canadian government should have had with regard to that? Niigan made a very important point. Through their own traditional culture, the First Nations were able to carry out this issue of vaccination. Now, I can give another example similar to that, like in Cuba. How come there's no anti-vax movement in Cuba? Because in Cuba, like other governments, such as, for example, China, the governments there use persuasion and education to facilitate the access, taking into account the different possibilities or difficulties that people can have. So this is really very important. Like specifically on the Ottawa trucker, why did Justin Trudeau not convene the Truckers Association, the truckers unions, all those involved, to discuss this with them? Look, we have this problem going over the border, in order to try to reach a consensus that is helpful for the Canadian society. But he did not do that. Instead, he took the sledgehammer, and this is what created the incident. And we're absolutely right. We have to point out the failures of the Trudeau government in dealing with this right from the beginning.
Thank you, Arnold. So I'm going to move on to our next round of questions. So I'm going to take 3 to begin, including one that has been posed in the chat quite a while ago from Raj Chauhan. So the question is, as we see that the left has not been able to mobilize masses and the far right were able to capitalize on frustration, can someone help to understand, and can state, even in transition to its abolition, can the state impose such mandates as many on the left have advocated? Can the proletariat protest such mandates? So from there, I will go to David Rennie, and then I will go to Yuri, and then I see Cheryl and Joel, you have your hands up as well. We'll take you in the next round of questions. And I should mention just before our speakers start to our next questioners. This is the first in a series of panels on this convoy. The next panel is scheduled for April 13th and is slated to focus more on panelists who have done investigative journalist work on the convoy specifically, to dive deeper into many of the questions that have been posed here. And the third will be, it doesn't have a date yet, but will be addressing the question of what how the left should respond to the pandemic generally. So if you're interested in those questions, do keep an eye out for the future installments of this series. So I will go to David Rennie for his question.
Radhika, you just partially answered some of the questions I had in your last talk, but still, I don't understand how you can still call the truckers movement fascist, because in fact, you know, with the big pharma colluding with the state and the mass media and the coercion and the propaganda, you know, it only makes people suspicious of the agenda and the outlawing of a lot of antivirals that have been proven effective. They were telling people, just go home, you can't do anything, just come to the hospital when you feel desperate, you know, just go home and take aspirin or something. That's not the way to treat it. We now know there's much better ways. They could have saved millions of lives, but the profit motive was promoted over anything, over lives or anybody. So how could you call that a fascist movement? This is a mass public demand. You know, it's a concern of the public, and that's why they're responding, you know, in such a big way. And the trucker strike reflected that, and people supported them because of it.
Thank you, David. And I will just add to that, just based on some of the questions I had been seeing in the chat, that there is a lot of questions about, you know, many of us have said that this is not a protest movement, yet protests have been a component of this movement. So how do the speakers kind of reconcile that description? And then similarly, just to speak to what you were mentioning, David, how do we make sense of you know, big pharma's interests in the Canada's public health response, which Radhika, you pointed out, has been so narrowly focused on vaccines? How do we make sense of their ability to shape a public response to a pandemic to suit their private interests? So with that, I'm going to go to Yuri.
Hi, thanks everybody. I'm sorry, I actually missed a lot of the panel discussion, but anywho, I just wanted to to ask anyone on the panel can comment on this. Is there is a problem with this pandemic. There are many people on the left who are COVID minimalists and COVID denialists. I've been shocked that a lot of outlets that I really like and really respect, I won't name names, but many of them have been engaging in COVID minimalism, that it's just like the flu, COVID denialism, that this is all, you know, a scamdemic, or they are anti-vax fundamentalism, in which there are some problems with, you know, the vaccine. Maybe the vaccines are dodgy, but then instead of advocating for left policies, like we have, like we all go under lockdown, but we provide the working class, we provide everyone with a UBI. That's what I think the left should have done. The left failed to do that, and those left-leaning folk who are supporting, who supported the Freedom Convoy, or are supporting a lot of the lockdown, anti-mask mandates and so forth. I do think that we sometimes do have to call a spade and say that this Freedom Convoy is a pseudo-populist, pseudo-leftist, but what it really is a reactionary movement. And I, would just like anyone's comments on that. And the question specifically for my friend Arnold August is, Cuba has been dealing with the pandemic reasonably well as Vietnam and China. Would allowing the Cuban vaccine make a lot of the anti-vaxxers on the left take the vaccine, or do you think that even if Cuba's vaccine was allowed to be in the market, that they would still say, no, I'm not taking the vax because COVID is a scam and whatnot?
Okay, thank you very much, Yuri. So I see that there were a couple questions directed directly towards Radhika. and then one to Arnold, and then we'll open it to both Brian and Q, who we haven't heard much from yet. So if there's any response to anything we've heard yet, we'll go to you after Radhika and then Arnold.
Yeah, okay. So to address David's very valid question. So first of all, I would like to say that, you know, of course, I mean, I'm not in favor of Big Pharma. I've been opposing Big Pharma even before the pandemic. I totally see that Big Pharma has used the pandemic in order to make enormous profits. And in fact, they've got the governments doing exactly what they want these governments to do. And that's partly why our COVID response has been so abysmal. So that's the first thing. But the problem of Big Pharma is one part of a much larger picture of a far more numerous mistakes that our governments have made in dealing with the pandemic. Our government's response, as I say, has been bad faith, it has been miserly, and it has been punitive. And you put all these things together, a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions, and thanks to social media, a lot of these questions are also essentially people who have questions are sucked into all sorts of rabbit holes into which they can go. So it is not surprising that a lot of people on the left, I mean, and that's why I always discuss the pandemic with everybody with a lot of patience, because I'm not into, you know, calling people, you know, deluded or whatever, deplorable or anything like that. I want to discuss because that's the only way in which we can make common sense of what's going on. There is a lot wrong, so let's unravel it. And I would say that from the beginning, the biggest scandal is that our governments talked about the competition between saving lives and livelihoods, as though these, in any decent society, these two things should be opposed. In the name of saving livelihoods, they initially even considered letting the pandemic rip through the population. They only decided not to do it because they realized that that would itself create such a big dislocation in the economy that it wasn't worth it. Then they decided that they were only going to try to flatten the curve. What does that mean? It means that we are going to allow the pandemic to rip, but only keep it down so that our healthcare systems, which have been depleted by 40 years of neoliberalism, they are already weakened. These weakened healthcare systems are not overwhelmed, which means that this was only a slightly less murderous response. So I'm not joking. These are our governments. These are governments of very, very rich countries that have performed way worse than far, far poor governments. So I don't doubt that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that truckers, you know, to me, and why am I calling truckers fascists? Another good question, and I'm open to all the reason that I can listen to. The reason I'm calling truckers fascists is because I don't think particularly that they raise the issue of vaccine mandates and so on. But quite frankly, I don't think vaccine mandates were the main thing they were about. They are about showing what they can do. They want their potential political customers to know what they can do. So when the time comes, they can be hired, they can be mobilized, they can be deployed. That's what I really feel. I think the vaccine mandate, you know, they said one day they want to overthrow the government, another day they are singing the praises. You know, they represent a new type of left, which is, by the way, why somebody said, you know, why so many Canadian flags? Because around the world, this type of right-wing formation is trying to portray itself as being patriotic. Canada is not the only one. They're doing that in America. They're doing that in Brazil. They're doing that in a lot of places. And also, one final point. The truckers are not a grassroots movement. They are an astroturf movement. This is another thing you have to remember. They have been mobilized by pouring lots of money into this. And even then, at the end of the day, once you are talking about big trucks, you only need a few thousand to create a huge ruckus. So they are actually, the trucks are compensating for numbers as well. So, so I think, yeah, I think that should be, I think that covers the main points I wanted to raise for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Radhika. So we'll go to Arnold. You had a question directed towards you as well.
Yes, just before I go to that question, I think what Radhika said is very important with regards to the movement. I mean, I think that that's why I raised the issue of Quebec as an example. Ottawa, definitely I agree, AstroTurf. Quebec, 1960s and 70s, it was terrorist with all that, but it's far closer to a grassroots movement than anything that we saw in Ottawa. I mean, they had support of an important section of the population. That is why Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act to smash not just the terrorists, but the whole movement to change things in Quebec. Now, with in response to Yuri's question with regards to the Canada's policy with regards to COVID-19 towards the First Nations is terrible. I remember to this day, not long after COVID-19 broke out, I think it was about 2 years ago, that the representatives of the First Nations in southern Manitoba made a formal written request to the Canadian government, please help us. We need the help of Cuban doctors and Cuban medication to help us stem the tide. What did Christine Freeland said 2 years ago? Oh no, we don't need it. We have the best health service in the world. Oh yeah, we saw how great that health service were. And, you know, by the way, as a leftist, I wrote at least 2 articles against Trudeau's anti-First Nation policy with regards to COVID. So, you know, when we talk about the left, I think we have to take into account different aspects of the left. Secondly, this is something more, why does not the Canadian government collaborate with the Cuban government, as does Iran, Russia, and China, to produce vaccines? Instead, they keep up this wall, superior white supremacist view that only us in Canada, we can handle. We can do anything better than people from the South. And that, to show one latest example of their attitude on COVID, a few weeks ago, the most important, well-known Cuban musical group, Buena Fe, was organizing a concert here in Canada. However, the Canadian government does not allow them to enter because the Canadian government does not recognize the Cuban vaccine, which is ridiculous because the Cuban vaccine is well known and recognized and recommended by all over the world, by people all over the world. So I, for one, have done that in the future. I'll do it again to denounce the Trudeau government's complete lack of ethics with regards to the question of vaccine towards the First Nation and to the entire population.
Thank you, Arnold. So I do just want to, so we've had in this round of questions, questions about the characterization of fascism, about the sort of that section of the left which downplays the importance of COVID-19, as well as questions about the fascist character of the movement. I'm wondering if Q or Brian, since we haven't heard from you in the Q&A so far, if you have any response to anything you've heard so far, anything you'd like to say.
I'll just briefly add something. I think that a lot of the questions about what the left might have done or what should have been done, Q raised very well in his, in his presentation. So I mean, he may want to speak to that. What I would say, and it keys off of, I think, something that Radhika was addressing, is that the issue really is not, are you pro-vaccines or are you anti-vaccines? The issue is not, are you pro-mandates or anti-mandates? Are you pro-lockdowns or anti-lockdowns? The fact of the matter is that under capitalism, profit is going to determine policies within the public health arena, policies that the state follows with regard to various provisions and activities. And I think we probably need a bit of humility on this question of what should be the response, in the sense that because everything is so perverted under capitalism, through this, the dictates of profit, that we have a great deal of difficulty actually knowing, what really should be done, and we have to operate within a context in which we are faced with capitalist priorities and capitalist structures. In Canada, we we had to deal with the fact that there's these provincial and federal jurisdictions, and each one of these areas is determined by a combination of federal intervention overriding policy laid atop, provincial capacities to kind of take particular directions. There was no planned economy. And the question which we haven't really addressed either is why did COVID happen? And it happened because of capitalism and because of the destruction of biodiversity, of global transformations. We're going to be faced with these kinds of pandemics and these kinds of public health issues on and on and on, as long as that goes on. And so while it's very easy to say, as I will say, that ultimately socialism is what the answer is. We have to build, a global socialist, possibility, or we are going to be constantly confronted with this. And that relates to climate change, and it relates to pandemics, and it relates to, exploitation, and it relates to racism as well. So it is a very difficult path, but what we do know is that capitalism does not have the answers. The actually existing socialist states, I think, have handled the pandemic a lot better, but I would also be critical of some of the measures there. I mean, to raise a question to Arnold, for instance, why is there no anti-vaccine movement in Cuba? I agree that there's likely to be far less anti-vax sentiment in Cuba, but my guess is that there is some there. We're not likely to hear much about it.
Thanks, Brian. So I see, yeah, I'd like to open it to Q, and I do want to raise the question again of whether whether a workers' movement can be anti-mandate or whether they can struggle against mandates, what that can look like, as well as this question of big pharma. So Q, if you have
Of course it can be. I mean, the idea that we limit the production and distribution of vaccines to 3 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and that workers don't have any sort of right or even an obligation to push against that, I think is frankly ridiculous. Like, I'm not sure why it is that we were willing to overlook the fact that Sinopharm has also developed a vaccine that seems to be fairly efficient, does very well, does everything that the vaccines produced by Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson appear to do, with far less, at least reported, injuries due to the vaccine. I'm not clear why it is that mandates are even necessary when mandates aren't even imposed at a, whether it's at a prefectural level or at a federal level. It's not even done in China. There are no mandates there. There are mandates at various municipal levels, and the state government has been asking municipalities to ease up on them. So this idea that to push back against them is to suddenly link hands with the right wing, I think it's buying into a frame of reference, or at least a bit of a rhetorical gambit that neoliberals have already set up. And I think it's in a way apologizing for and feeling a little bit guilty of our own points of view, our own ideology, which is that there must be eternal struggle against the neoliberal bourgeois state. So the idea that out of fear of looking like anti-vaxxers, or a fear of looking like vaccine hesitants, or a fear of looking like COVID minimizers, we shouldn't make very real and very strenuous opposition to mandates and to the closing off of the ability to distribute vaccines that are outside of the reach of 3 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I find that to be a joke. I don't think we should ever feel guilty about our ideology or feel guilty about what our purpose is here. And yeah, I just, it's very frustrating because I hear this coming even from comrades to some extent. And frankly, it's buying into the same kind of guilt that the same people that would watch us, watch our worker movements be crushed, watch solidarity be broken apart, and be more than happy to uphold this idea of like a meritocracy or some sort of technocracy, that we should simply just listen to people who have various credentials rather than listening to people that have the workers' interests at heart. I find that a little bit disheartening in itself.
Thank you very much for that, Q. So I'm going to move on now to our the last 2 hands I see. So we'll go first to Cheryl, and then we will go to Joel Kettner.
Hi, Cheryl is actually Kim Pollock here in the home of the Kakite First Nation in New Westminster, the stolen lands of the Kakite. I don't believe that there is any working class or much noticeable working class or trade union or left take up of the this petty bourgeois populist movement. And that's what we're dealing with. There's populism and then there's populism, right? This is a petty bourgeois populist movement that originated in the States. It exists amongst the petty bourgeoisie, evangelical Christians, and rural folk in the States. It's spilled over into Canada just simply because that's what happens with all kinds of political movements in the US. The left, I don't believe, should be beating itself up about whether we should support these people or not. These are fascists. This is a fascist movement. Don't kid yourself. It has no connection to the labor movement. It has no connection to working people. If you talk to actual real working people on the ground, like I do here in Sapperton every day, they don't believe these guys are anything except whiny crybabies. They are not disciplined. They are not publicly minded. They are not solidaristic, and they're against them. And if you look at the polling, if 85% of people in British Columbia are vaccinated, most of those people have to be working class people. My son went down to Terminal Avenue in Vancouver and threw rocks at the Convoy when 500 people from East Vancouver went down and blocked their progress here in Vancouver. This is an anti-human, anti-left movement that we should fight against concertedly. And the left shouldn't be beating itself up as to whether we should be, we should separate the whole question of the effectiveness or the quality of the rollout of the vaccines from the question of what do we do about a right-wing populist movement running around Canada.
Thank you for those remarks, Cheryl.
I'm Kim, actually.
Apologies, yes. Thank you, Kim. So we'll move on to Joel. And then I do see that David has raised his hand once more, so we'll maybe open it up to the three of you and then we'll have the panelists respond.
Thank you. I'm really pleased that this event is happening. It's really hard to find an event, and it has been hard for 2 years to find an event with a fulsome conversation about any aspect of the pandemic response. And I am in public health as a specialist and as an academic, and I haven't been able to find it in the environments in which I work. Not only have I not been able to find it, they've been discouraged. And anyone who dares to ask a question about any aspect of public health officials or government response is stereotyped. So that's my first point, stereotyping. You know, at the beginning, and maybe this question is for you, Radhika, fascism. So I know more about public health than politics and what fascism really is, but stereotyping seems to me to be one aspect of fascism. It, painting people or groups with one brush, simplifying, polarizing, ostracizing, scapegoating. I thought those were all characteristics of fascism. A second characteristic is that there's only one truth, and any other points of view or questions are not accepted in a fascist state. The third aspect I think about fascism, and this comes back to Alan, I appreciate so much your point about dialogue and listening, because I think a third feature of fascism is an inability to create places, environments, whether it's in the media or anywhere else, to have open dialogue where honest questions can be asked about things which have already been decided to be true or false. So here's my overarching question. What is going on here in response to this pandemic that makes it almost impossible to have conversations, ask questions, ask governments and public health officials to explain their decisions and why. I'm not, like, I don't think it's anti-mandate, anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine. That's the stereotyping that's going to make it impossible for full understanding. The issues have to be debated and discussed in themselves, looking at with a class analysis, who's benefiting, who's being harmed from these policies. I don't think it's equal. Anyway, I could go on, I won't. I just want to ask the question, why is this happening, not just in Canada, but in so many other countries, that there's a lid on conversation, that there's a fear of discussion about this? What's going on? That's my question. What is going on?
Thank you, Joel. So I'll open it to David, and then we'll go to Radhika, who had a question directed towards her, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panelists.
I agree with your comments, Joel. And, it appears to me that there's hysteria surrounding this vaccines and the mandates that was created divide people. And to say that there's no worker support, working class support, even union support is wrong, because a lot of the nurses unions in Western Canada have opposed the layoffs and dismissals of people who did not want to take the vaccine. Medical professionals, there's a lot of dissenters too in the medical profession and nurses, and to call them all fascists, to stereotype. You can see how Trudeau called anybody that showed up at the protest there as a fascist. There was one guy with a Nazi flag, he seemed like a provocateur, and another guy with a Confederate flag, and dismissed them as all racist and fascist. I wouldn't debate it. It's woke culture, it's cancel culture, and that's what's happening now at the left now. Anybody that criticizes the mandates and what's in the vaccine and how it's being used and the effects from it, you're just attacked viciously. And anybody that supports the truckers are considered fascists, so this is ridiculous. And Kim, I don't know why you could call them all fascists. I know, I agree that the right wing has come in and taken the vacuum away from the left, and they've used it. They're moving into to gain support for a right wing agenda, but it doesn't mean that the people support that. It's their core demands are to stop the mandates, and job dismissals because of somebody doesn't want to take the vaccine. Many people have health issues and they're concerned about the effects from the vaccine. So how can you say that they're all fascists, Kim?
Thanks, David.
Because it's a fascist movement. Doesn't matter whether they individually, personally are all fascists. It is a fascist right-wing movement. It has all the earmarks. It's an old part of the right's playbook. This is how one of the ways that the American government and IT&T took down Allende was to put a bunch of truckers to snargle the country's highways and transportation system, and because they're great big large vehicles that you can cause a lot of disruption with, and so it isn't that they're personally individually fascist, it's that the movement is a fascist movement, and we have a good obligation as the left to identify them as such and deal with them as such.
Thank you, Kim. So
I guess my question is, how do we deal with them in your estimation, right? Like, regardless of whether, and I'll speak as somebody who was personally targeted by the yellow vesters, like targeted for harassment and received death threats. I guess my question to you is, what do you mean by deal with them? How do we deal with them when they have no ability to create policy? They may be able to influence it. They may be able to move public discourse. But I think the idea that, dealing with these disparate elements of reactionary movements is our primary responsibility. I find that to be a little bit risible, and that, the people who actually have power, the people that are able to pass legislation, people with the ability to shape these frameworks, the people with the ability to create, not only create, but propagate media narratives and shut down voices. I think those are the people that we ought to be dealing with. And I think that these disparate elements are a little bit less of concern to me anyway.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks, Q, and thank you, Kim. I think we'll maybe try and continue this in a moment, but I do want to go to Radhika. Did have a question directed towards her, and then we'll open it back up to the panelists once more, and we'll move on there. Go ahead, Radhika.
Right. So first of all, let me agree with Kim that there are some working people undoubtedly in the truckers' convoy, but that does not make it a working class movement. And I also want to add one other thing. Earlier, Brendan talked about the Naujawan movement, and that it's a movement. One of the things that is often forgotten when we talk about the working class is how diverse it has become. So as far as the truckers are concerned, there are an enormous number of non-white truckers, most of whom are vaccinated. They are worker truckers. They are not owner-operators of the sort that landed up in Ottawa. And a lot of these people have concerns that are completely independent. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, I also agree that we are characterizing a movement, and that's what I'm characterizing as fascist. And I'm also underlining that while they are using the vaccines and vaccine mandates, etc., as a way of, while they claim to be about that, they're actually not necessarily about that. The fact of the matter is this is not really an issue in Canada. The overwhelming majority of people are vaccinated. And among those who are not vaccinated, I would distinguish, for reasons that various speakers have mentioned, I would distinguish, I think Q mentioned them, I would distinguish between those who are anti-vaxxers and those who are unvaccinated because access has been difficult. So that's the second thing I would like to say. Now, Raj Chavan earlier had asked, and we did not answer his question. He said, what about vaccine mandates? Should they be imposed, etc.? And my own view is that, I think there can be a lot of dispute about this, but basically what has happened is that our governments are choosing the route of vaccine mandates because they have from the beginning taken a miserly and punitive, that is to say authoritarian approach to this. So they are mandating vaccines as part of that authoritarianism. Historically, vaccination works best when it is done by persuasion. And this is the approach that should have been followed. So I think that this is my response. So that successful vaccine campaigns have rarely needed to mandate anything. Thirdly, I also understand that there are informed people, including health workers, who have, for various reasons, they have questions. And I don't think the way to deal with these questions is to dragoon them. If you have ensured access, if you have made sure that everybody who wants a vaccine gets a vaccine, you will have a level of vaccination which will be enough for everybody. You won't need vaccine mandates. I also want to say one other thing, because a number of questions, Joel asked, why is there no discussion? Why is there no rational discussion? That is partly, as I say, because of the approach our governments have taken. They are the ones, our politicians are the ones who are out stigmatizing people who may have questions about vaccines. I think it's perfectly healthy to have questions about vaccines and about every other element. I think somebody mentioned in the chat that practically every decision that was taken by our governments could have been questioned on a scientific basis. And that's where I want to bring in one thing. There has, throughout this pandemic, where I have had as many questions as anybody, I've been writing about it, I'm still writing about it, there has been one point of sanity for me. In the UK, where the government also took an extremely authoritarian and punitive response, there is a so-called SAGE group, that is a scientific advisory group on emergencies, which advises the government. Not only so the government doesn't necessarily take its advice. So a group of doctors who are committed to the public nature of the National Healthcare Service, which has been gutted over the years, but nevertheless, they are committed to its public vocation. They got together and created something called the Independent SAGE. If you haven't gone to their website, please search Independent Sage, SAGE. Go to their website, take a look. They have had the most measured and the best set of opinions about the pandemic, mostly focused on Britain, but because our situation is pretty similar, most of it also applies to us. And I think that's where you will find serious debate. So for example, on the question of vaccine mandates, the doctors who are part of this group, the medical professionals who are part of this group are divided. And they say, some of them are in favor of vaccine mandates and others are not. And they say so. So once you get to see the genuine discussion, the stupid opposition, the social media related opposition, the political use of the genuine questions that people have is not there. So that's I guess the final thing I will say for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Would any of the other speakers like to chime in on anything that we've heard here? Okay. If there are no further comments, then I've seen two last questioners. So this will be the last two questions that we take. I see Errol Sharp has a hand up. I also saw that Daniel Jie had a hand up as well. If you'd like to ask your question, you can go after Errol. But Errol, you have the floor.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I have had all of the available vaccinations. And if there is a booster shot that's coming along, I'll have that too. Having said that, I think that we need to, and one of the things that has not been discussed very much around the issue of vaccine is that, first of all, these vaccines were rushed into production, probably with not complete scientific rigor going into them. And it has led to the point that now we have to have booster after booster after booster, which of course is a great asset to Big Pharma, Pfizer and Moderna and the rest of them. It seems to me they were rushed into production for two reasons. One was to make a hell of a lot of money for the big drug companies. The other was to appease people. The government wanted people to think that we were doing something useful here. And, the problem with all of this discussion, it seems to me, is that we talk about the right, we criticize the right, we analyze the right. I know a hell of a lot more about the right than I know about the left, because we never talk about much the left. We refer to it, we talk about this, we talk about socialism, but we never discuss it. We never talk about what our vision for the future is. We say our vision is socialism. Well, if you can tell me what that really means in practice, then I would love you to do it. But I haven't seen it happen yet. And I think the problem here is we see everything in a kind of a polar opposite, rather than seeing the dialectical relationship between these kinds of things. And we can't talk about the right without talking. How can we expect people to support the left when they don't know anything about it?
Thank you, Errol. So I'll just open it up once again to Daniel Jie. If you do still want to ask a question, you're welcome to.
So this isn't so much of a question as it's more of an observation, but like looking into some of the discussions some of the folks here have raised about the nature of the convoy, we have the organizers the organizers act stating that while there may, and the speaker stating that while there may be some legitimate grievances within some working class formations within the convoy, or that it's a significant problem of how mandates and vaccines are enacted in this society, the convoy itself is ultimately a petty bourgeois movement. Which is actually something I would agree on. And I'm also going to this is also a question to direct to some of the, for purpose of discussion, but what do you make of the revelations that's been going around about how the convoy, this has actually been touched on in chat a bit, the revelations that the convoy was basically quite literally funded by big money from the US. There were a couple of influential billionaires and political figures in the US that used stuff like GoFundMe to, as exposed by Ben Norton, used sources like GoFundMe in order to create funding for the convoy. And I think this is a clear indication that there is the class character or the nature of this movement, rather than some sort of movement, genuine working class movement, or more of a right-wing petty bourgeois movement that banged on certain rhetoric and quote unquote concerns. So I'm wondering the question is that how much of this movement is actually say, how much of this movement is actually organic? I honestly organic, and how does this how does the funding of the dark money funding of the convoy movement influence I'm wondering if, actually no, let me rephrase that. Sorry, about how I phrase this. How does I'm wondering if it's useful for future webinars to discuss about the possible funding of the movement and how that correlates to its social and class character.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Apologies, I phrased it really kind of awkwardly.
I think the question is clear. So for our last set of questions, we have just question of, we have Errol's question about what is this socialism we keep speaking about, and what is the left, and what is the left response to this? And then the question of the financing and the class character, and there was some mention of the US connection. So if any of the speakers would like to speak on these last subjects, and then we'll close.
In response to Errol's question, which is very valid, can the left agree on this very simple thing? I remember when this COVID first broke out 2 years ago, there was a nursing home in Montreal owned by two capitalists with very suspect links to the drug cartel in Montreal. In their hospital or healthcare, over 5 people died in their excrement. They were unable and unwilling to take care of that. Does this not, with many other examples, show that the main feature that the capitalism, the neoliberalism is not able to satisfy the people on a very basic point, such as healthcare? And thinking about it, this is what we have to have as a conclusion, at least that this capitalist system cannot take care of its people through its health system. They handed this to us on a golden platter. It's obvious for everyone. Now, the point is, I was just thinking about it. The truckers, aside from whatever you want to call them, their activity objectively sidetracked the opinion and the feelings of the people across the country, the left or any people across the country, that this system is not working. If they can handle health, what's the problem? We cannot continue with this system. And that should have been the main discussion. I think this is the main discussion now, that we have to unite on that one point.
Thanks very much, Arnold. I see Radhika has a hand up, and then we'll move over to Brian and Q for any closing remarks.
Yeah, I would like to hear from Brian and Q as well, but very briefly, I just want to say one quick thing. In this session, we ended up talking a lot more about COVID than I thought we would. I thought we would focus a lot more on the truckers' convoy. But that is fine. It's very clear to me that the reason why this has happened is because everybody thinks the truckers' convoy was about opposition to that somehow the truckers convoy is the only opposition to COVID. And I think I hope it's clear, number one, that the truckers convoy is not about COVID at all. And number two, that there are serious questions to be asked about the government's COVID strategy. And number three, that the best place to do it is to start a left discussion, which is far more complex than simply opposing vaccines or vaccine mandates. So I hope that in the next two sessions, we'll have a wider discussion about the truckers convoy. But I also agree that COVID is another issue, and the proper left response to COVID is another issue, which I think we will talk about in the last panel as well. So we'll come back to that. That's all. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated everybody's questions and discussions and all, and speeches. Yeah.
Thank you, Radhika. Brian, Q, any last thoughts on any of the questions we've had so far? Anything that's been heard today?
No, I think I've said my piece.
Yeah, I've said mine, I think, too. I'd like to thank everybody for their comments and discussion, which was interesting. Maybe I'll just, to Daniel's point about following the money, I have had a look at the hacked GoSendMe contributions. It's huge. I haven't explored it rigorously. It's about 20,000 names there, but there's big money there, and actually the big money probably won't even show up on the GoFundMe and the GoSendMe. That's going in other channels that are very difficult to trace. But it is there are a lot of small contributions there. Small money follows big money. It's the way it works under capitalism, and the money is, there is a large amount of money, and that's a factor very definitely. On whether it's fascist or not, you can tell from the language I've used, I'm a little less inclined than Radhika to put it that way, but there is no question that this is a movement that is led by the alt-right, that draws in some working class people, but its leadership is petty bourgeois. Its funding is more dark, I'd say, and on a large sense, is more the kind of dark money that is very active in funding the right-wing populist, mobilizations of our time. And it does have agendas that reach well beyond mandates. That was very clear in the as much as it was chaotic and incoherent, the manifesto that the Convoy leadership first put out. The interesting point will be whether or not this mobilization sustains itself in the future, or whether, as I tried to suggest, equally the threat might well be the state and the Emergencies Act and the residue of that. Thanks very much.
And I think with that, thanks to everyone who attended, and of course to the speakers. Thanks also to the Society for Socialist Studies for co-organizing, to the International Manifesto Group. Thank you to our media sponsor, the Canada Files, as well as our other sponsors, Fire This Time Social Movement and Canadian Dimension. Thanks everyone to the 70 plus people who are still with us almost 3 hours later. This has been a really great discussion, and this is again the first of an ongoing series. The next series will, the next installment will be April 3rd, and the last installment has not been decided yet, but keep an eye out on the International Manifesto Group's websites for more updates there. So thank you very much to everybody, and we can close.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.